Great. And we'll move on to the second paper, which is Jeffrey Tibbett from Northumbria University. Jeffrey, were you at Sandhurst, or are you still at Sandhurst as a teacher there?
Yeah, I'm still at Sandhurst. I'm currently sat at Sandhurst right now.
Oh, okay. Right. Okay, great. So you're going to talk about British Army leadership, a holistic approach. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Captain Jeff Tibbett, and I'm a part-time DBA student serving in the British Army, specifically the infantry, since 1998. During that period, I've been deployed on several operational tours on the front line, namely 2 tours of Northern Ireland, 3 tours of Iraq, and 3 tours of Afghanistan. And I'm currently serving at the Royal Military Academy, Sandhurst. And what I'm going to talk to this morning about is leadership. Right then, what we're going to go through then is that we're going to cover 4 areas, mindful that I'm really on in my data analysis journey. I've conducted 15 interviews, transcribed about 7 of them so far. So it's really a preliminary look at the data. So what is the Royal Military Academy? Royal Military Academy is declared by some academics like Dr. Mike Rennie as the gold standard of officer academies, rivalled currently only by West Point, but if you look at the paper recently, the Chinese Military Academy is coming on leaps and bounds. Its international reputation is evidenced by the 40 or so countries that pay quite an extreme amount to send their representatives here each term, particularly from the Middle East, in order to say that they've been trained at the Royal Military Academy. So, I want to look at leadership in the Royal Military Academy, and I'm particularly looking at some of the less savoural behaviours within here. But at one point, I thought my research may have been in vain. Recently, they released a book called The Habit of Excellence by the Centre of Army Leadership, and I'll read out a brief synopsis from this book. The Habit of Excellence is a unique insight into British Army leadership, drawing on the latest research in military history, sociology, psychology and behavioural science, going beyond the latest leadership fads to instill into one peerlessly authoritative work the essence of leadership, leading and leadership from the world's most revered establishment. At this point, I thought that I'd probably wasted about 2 years of my doctoral journey. So what I did is I looked back at these times, and what I did is I conducted a search for news within the 4 weeks of the publishment of that book, which was on October the 15th of this year. And I found a number of articles that reinforced that we still had a leadership problem. You could be forgiven for thinking all these articles are about soldiers, and you'd be right in that. So what I did then is I searched and narrowed it down to Army officers. People would say that this is a junior officer with his coat wound too tight, or that this senior officer was simply snapped after his recent operational tours, that people will always take advantage of financial opportunities, and that these sexual incidents were at the lower end of the spectrum. So I decided to tighten the search even further. Before officer cadets get to the Royal Military Academy, they're selected by the Army Officer Selection Board. And during the year-long journey here, the values and standards are constantly reinforced and discussed. Sure, there could be no incidents here, but within the same 1 month search journey, I found a number of incidents here at the Academy. So it seems my research has not been in vain, and I am still in a good position to look at leadership here at the Academy. So what do we teach here? Values-based leadership is what is currently taught at the Academy, and it was taught as a result of the Aitken inquiry and the Hutton report, as it was directly espoused that the values were a problem within leadership. The specific flavour then is servant leadership, the motto engraved into the cap badge itself of the Royal Military Academy, serve to lead. But this is not the servant leadership espoused by Greenleaf in his seminal work about the courier across the mountain. It's actually a combination of a smattering of styles meshed together and is more akin to leadership as service, a view that the royal family themselves take. So I really wanted to unpick why this occurs. And if we look at these army values and standards, well then nothing should be occurring of this nature or particularly appearing in the news. And what I felt is there was something unspoken, maybe narcissistic or Machiavellian values that must be underneath this leadership at the academy. And what I came to is this by Paul House in 2002. I initially looked at the whole doctrine of leadership together, but although psychopathy has been linked to service people with 2% evidence to have aggressive psychopathic tendencies in a study by Swank and Marchand, anecdotal and personal experience led me to concentrate on the subclinical narcissism and Machiavellianism. I've seen firsthand people manage themselves around their own career and believe that in order to be the Chief of General Staff, you would have to display some of these tendencies to some degree, or you'd simply fail or lose to those around you. There is research that indicates a combination of these traits, Machiavellianism and narcissism to the subclinical level, lead to a mentality of trying to game the system. And I think that's where some academic officer cadets and army officers actively try to do. So what I'm going to look at now is, I'll come on to my personal position later on. What I'm going to look at is my objectives. The reason I'm looking at my objectives rather than my research aims is because of my reflexive position. Means that my research questions evolve over time, and that although my objectives are not completely anchored in, I think that they're much more astute to look at those. We're going to look at my objectives, look at the social construction of leadership within the academy, and I'll come on to my personal position on social construction slightly later. If you look at it, it says reflect. My own personal experience are not discounted in this, which is a reflexive leadership and a reflexive study, nor should they be. I'm inside the organisation and I have my own biases. To try and approach from a positivistic position and not acknowledge my own position and biases within it would feel inauthentic. If you look at there, it also talks about the lived experience of cadets, and we're going to come on about the Sword of Honour later on, which I believe is a really good lens in which to view this through. Right, and this is the current British Army leadership definition. As they say, a definition is a sack of flour compressed into a thimble, but I think this is more the sack of flour than the thimble. We will think back to our last presentation about the projection of character within the Royal Air Force definition. Projection of character and projection of personality is seen by some as quite a toxic leadership trait. I won't dwell on toxicity itself, as then I'll discuss later on about my view on the morality of leadership. But but like I say, the projection of personality, already character in the RAF's view, really leads us to think about narcissistic tendencies. We're going to look at briefly at social constructionism, and this is my epistemological position. My social constructionism position looks at and links to Kenneth Gergen's later work. It's quite a pragmatic, soft approach to social constructionism and views social constructionism as ontologically mute, although Gergen does say that it can be approached in a relativist position. Social constructionism, if you look at number one, always believe there is a bias, and research is a participatory, inclusive process. If you look at number two, the cultural society specificity, a social constructionist and I believe that one view is not the view. Cultures and societies build their own versions, realities and concepts. However, and that generalisability, therefore, is not deemed attainable. I think, in particular, the British Army has a problem with this, specifically with its understanding of truth. British Army itself, when you talk about truth, we had a particular problem with this in Afghanistan, where that they believe truth to be a very positivistic thing. It's either right or wrong, it's truth or it's untrue. And in Afghanistan, where truth, I think, has a more social constructed element, that people believe truth from other people, depending on the cultures of the society, meant that we fell foul to that, and we still continue to fall foul to that. Number 3, then, we acknowledge knowledge as a social process. Social processes, therefore, the truth of knowledge is similarly socially constructed, and knowledge doesn't sit in isolation. Although it's socially constructed, it's susceptible to the power relations of broader society and cultures. It's a practical effect on society. Burr uses an example how the temperance movement changed the alcoholic from a blameworthy participant to a victim. What I'm going to talk about now is my personal position. My position, the easiest academic position, is that of Fairhurst and Grant in their Social Construction of Leadership Assailing Guide. And if you read that through, you can unpick, it's a co-construction, not only with other people, with the socio-historical context, constantly renegotiated as a situation, context, and other factors change. My personal position is that leadership is contextual, situational, and personal, with all 3 factors having a say in what efficient leadership looks like. And I use the word efficient deliberately. And the definition removes the morality and the good-bad dichotomy from leadership. Leadership can be moral or immoral, good or bad. But the leader, I believe that a leader can be effective in spite of having low morals or unethical behaviours. This is in direct opposition, I agree, to some academics such as Burns, who believe that if it's unethical or immoral, it's not leadership. But this thesis, this research, views morality as a social construction and not a static anchor, and can therefore change due to perception, even if the actions and behaviours do not change. Also, those with a moralistic view to leadership need to defend against the Hitler problem, which we don't from a social constructed background. Right then, it's from I'm viewing this research from a relativistic, social constructionist position, as I've discussed, but reflexivity is seen as key. Reflexivity is about my awareness, aware of my environment and context, and it allows that my personal experience is a legitimate source of knowledge. It also acknowledges that my social background and assumptions will intervene in the research process, and it involves the interviews as a co-construction rather than a positivistic, unbiased opinion. The Sword of Honour, I discussed it earlier on, and what I'm doing is when I'm interviewing these officer cadets, I'm unpicking through the Sword of Honour. So the Sword of Honour is presented in a totally subjective way to the officer cadet and deemed by the commandant to be the best of the intake. It has a real narcissistic element because it's presented by the sovereign's representative personally. Here you see Boris Johnson presenting it. Last week on Friday it was presented by Princess Anne. In addition to that narcissistic element of being stood in front of everyone on parade, the sword itself has a monetary value of about £1,500. And I feel that by unpicking and asking about the Sword of Honour, asking who do you think should be awarded the Sword of Honour, who do you think will be, unpacking the differences between who should and who will, I find out and I get an insight into the officer cadets' understanding of leadership, because the Sword of Honour is presented in effect to the best leader of the intake. While conducting these interviews, which is on the intermediate term of the intake, I discovered another aspect, the Sovereign's Banner competition, which is given to the best platoon. There are some other bonuses to be in this platoon. Sovereign's platoon are presented separately. They also get spoken to the Sovereign's representative. They're given a special lanyard and a banner and use of a special bar in the academy. But there's another element to this. The platoon commander, the directing staff, gets a letter from the Queen, and that has driven some quite difficult behaviours in the officer cadets in this hyper-competitive environment that I'll come on to in a moment. Right, and the methods then. The pilot. So I initially did a pilot, and I was looking at the leadership model for Sandhurst. So I did a pilot with a person who is an ex-chief of the General Staff, and we were discussing about his time at the academy. And what I couldn't get over is how painful and how even after being chief of the General Staff, he felt it really difficult that he didn't get the Sword of Honour. The narcissist in him wouldn't let it go. He mentioned that I didn't get the Sword of Honour, but I got a military cross later on, and that makes it okay. But then he checked himself, and the impact of this Sword of Honour was something I hadn't really considered, and the impact of some of the more difficult and more dark leadership tenets. He discussed ruthlessness, and he was told that he wasn't ruthless enough. And I was thinking, if these dark leadership behaviours are so important, then why haven't we discussed them? One of my roles is I sit on the interview panel for officer cadets when they go to regiments. And I had an officer cadet who sat there and told me he was become top of the platoon commander's battle course. The platoon commander's battle course is probably one of the hardest courses an infantry officer can do, in Brecon over 8 weeks. This officer cadet had no context, no grounding to say that he would come top of that course. But the panel who selected these officers really loved that narcissistic hubris, and they actively searched for it. We had numerous officer cadets who told us that if they came to our regiment, they would be a general, they would be a brigadier, with again no grounding. But it seemed that the panel searched for this narcissistic Machiavellian tendency within them and actively promoted it. So I've interviewed so far 15 officer cadets. I was worried that these officer cadets would be a really narrow demographic, that it would be these narcissistic Machiavellian officer cadets, these blade runners, as they call them, who are searching for the Sword of Honour. But I got quite a broad demographic of a mix of blade runners seeking the Sword of Honour and seeking to influence the directing staff at every opportunity, and therefore wanted an interview by myself, and also those that wanted their story heard, that had really difficult or poor experiences of the academy and wanted to relay them to someone, wanted to explain that how a platoon commander made them cry, and some other instances that I'll come on to in a moment. And if we look and as I said earlier on, it's constantly evolving, my question set, and what I'm using is reflexive, or it's a type of, or not reflective thematic analysis. And as a method, not a methodology, in exactly the way that Braun and Clark initially identified it to be used. As a values-based practice, not as not outside of values.
Last 2 minutes, Jeffrey.
Yeah, I will wrap up. My preliminary results then. This is what I found that was happening. DS watching was one that they came up with a lot. DS watching is where the staff will be present and officer cadets will actively perform better than they would usually. Tactical biffing. This is particularly pertinent to Sobden's banner events. The stronger members of the platoon for Sobden's banner events, particularly fitness events, would encourage and actively seek to get weaker members of the platoon to go sick to the medical officer in order that they do not partake in that activity, which to me was abhorrent. The combat cliques. This is where groups of combat, so traditionally in the British Army, traditionally it's the top third that comes to combat, and they would form really difficult insider cliques that others couldn't really get into and felt excluded from. Tactical dragging is where someone who is a platoon commander in a platoon commander's appointment, who's searching for the Sword of Honour, someone who's in a lesser appointment, such as section commander, would actively perform poorly in order to try and drag the platoon commander's grade down in order to make them less competitive against us. And what all that came out is a really hyper-competitive environment which produced and promoted these lesser behaviours. Well, moving forward, I've got a second round of interviews with the same participants, which will then be closer to the rewarding of the Sword of Honour. So I think we'll also bring out more of these dark leadership and difficult behaviours. But what I really want to look at investigating is if those Machiavellian and narcissistic individuals actually outperform those that don't have those. And are we then, in effect, hamstringing people that don't have those behaviours by actively promoting those that do? And that is the end of my brief chat about my preliminary research. I'm just wondering.
Thanks very much, Jeffrey. Let me just ask the first question while people think about this. So I'm struck by your focus on narcissism and Machiavellianism, and I'm struck because it exactly resembles some work I was looking at last year, which is about, well, the kind of overview is the way that we confuse confidence with competence all the time, not just in the military, but generally speaking. And then underneath that, there is an issue about this particular piece of research is done by some Dutch researchers, Brummelman et al. And they went into primary schools and asked the children which child in the classroom was going to be the best leader. And 95% of the children chose the most narcissistic child. And then when they came to the task that they'd set, it replicated what you've just demonstrated, that these people are no better than any other child in getting the task done, but we still focus on the narcissism. So there's something here about the way that this is a kind of, it's not inevitable, but it certainly starts very young. And I think what you've just focused on is the way that Sandhurst generates this at an even higher level. And the difficulty is, so how do you get around it?
I think one of the problems as well is that people who have been selected in that way then select others who are similar to them. So it's narcissists and Machiavellians select other narcissistic people and Machiavellian people. So I think it's breaking the cycle of that I think the problem is, especially in the senior echelons of the army now. I think there's that one where the army itself battle not with monsters lest you become a monster. You gaze into the abyss also gazes into you. And I think that's because that senior officer has been in these combat environments and they've had to do quite a slightly different type of leadership where they probably had to have been a little bit more narcissistic, more direct, more Machiavellian. That generation of leaders select the next generation of leaders that are as similar to them as they can. And I don't think that's necessarily the right thing.
Thanks very much. Okay, Leo, you have a question. Do you want to ask your question, Leo?
Yeah, just very briefly. Thanks, Jeffrey. That was really fascinating. There's a couple of things going on here that really struck me as interesting in the sense that on one hand, you've got the kind of military culture, which clearly is a very important aspect to you. And we're kind of familiar with the intense levels of toxicity, the jealousies, the sword of honor, and all of that kind of traditional baggage. But also the things you were saying resonated with me in terms of what we know about business schools in a civilian environment, right? It seems to me that military training, military academies, and business school education are both regarded as kind of toxic, male-dominated, old-fashioned, problematic in lots of ways. So I wonder if you've looked at any of the literature about business schools, a critical literature on business schools, which looks at not only the curriculum and what is taught, but also the makeup of the kind of MBA students who want to join it. So it strikes me as something quite similar you're doing here. You're looking at an organization, a teaching environment, which has problems both in the deliverer of that teaching and the student of that teaching. Both are problematic, right? I wonder if that might be something for you to comment on and look at.
I haven't really looked at anything external to the army because my position is that it's societal, cultural, and I can't get generalizability. I think I'd be in a difficult position to defend it if I then started taking that research. And if you see what, it'd be good for me to look at it as anecdotal reinforcement evidence, but I don't think I could actually use it in my thesis, if you see what I mean.
Well, I meant just in literature to discuss in that first couple of chapters sort of thing, yeah.
Yeah, and I think some of the Alverson and people like that talk about the problems with management research, that it doesn't have any value. I think David Turish as well does a few papers about the lack of real value in management research today, which I think resonates with some of the work I do.
Okay, thank you. Caroline, did you have a question?
I do, thank you. I think it's great research. I think you're being very brave as well, I think, looking at this and tackling it the way you are. And I would also say that the problems you're discussing aren't exclusive to Sandhurst. We see them at Cranwell as well. Although my eyebrows raised a few times when you were talking, so I think that perhaps it's more intense at Sandhurst from my experiences of Cranwell. And I was thinking that there's two things that came to mind. One was, have you thought about asking the cadets about the people they don't think are good leaders and why they think that? You know, that opposite perspective could shine a different light on things. We used to have something I used to call the Booby Prize at Cranwell, the most improved cadet. And I didn't even get that. That's how bad I was. But I think that just gives it another perspective. You know, that might open up things a little bit more for you. And I think
so. Sorry, go on.
I don't know if you've even got as far as thinking as contributions that your research is going to make. But for me, I'm involved in a project called the Military Afterlives, which looks at how people transition into civilian life, and the research that the evidence we're seeing there is that how people behave in the military carries on beyond the military environment, and that's just another, you know, what are the consequences for society of letting these people who've benefited from these behaviours out into the wider world, because everyone, hopefully, fingers crossed, leaves the military eventually.
So for the first part, so when I do the interviews, one of the things, the way I do them is I ask them to do small stories, because it's difficult to overcome the barrier that they know who I am. So in order to try and overcome that barrier, so what I ask them is, can you explain to me a story about your worst leadership and your best leadership at the academy? Unpick that. What was the good behaviours they had? What was the bad behaviours? And I do that before I come into the Sword of Honour. It's like a run-in. And yeah, I've had some difficult conversations with them about poor leadership behaviours that they've had at the academy. And yeah, it's been difficult because they come out with incidents that I think could never have occurred here.
Okay, thanks. We just have time for one last question from Victor.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. It was really interesting. And I was wondering, because leadership, usually the rhetoric of leadership is hero-centric, and it tends to blend power asymmetries. So it tends to look for different ways to decrease resistance in workplaces or institutions. And from your point of view, especially in organizations where there are explicit power asymmetries, like in the army, in which you have to follow the chain of command, how do you see the role of power within this context that you are studying?
I think it goes on to, I think the role of power here is very transactional. It's not, so we say they're doing transformational leadership, and I think a question flopped up from Brian Waters, but they don't. So we explain to them they're doing transformational leadership at the academy. This is what we're teaching, this is what we espouse them to do, but they do no transformational leadership, because everything they do here is conducted by a finite time barrier. You need to do this by them, and it forces them into doing transactional leadership at every opportunity, because they haven't got the freedom or the space to conduct any transformational leadership. And I think that's a real, we sit there and tell them they should be transformational, but we don't give them the time or the space to be that type of leader, I think.
Okay, that's perfect timing. Thank you very much, Jeffrey. Thank you for all the questions. That was really good paper.